All right, in this video, we're going to look a little bit further into how to use this table and how to understand the quadrants and even do some examples involving that. We'll then take it a step further. And what if instead I give you the answer, like sine of an angle is 1/2, what angle would that be, and so forth. So what we call the arc sine or the arc cosine or the arc tangent of angles. So we'll look at those as well today. To begin, we need to make sure we can complete this chart, and you'll see me do this a number of times throughout class, but also in this video. It's important that you can complete this table, so I'd encourage you at this point, if you're listening to this video, I want you just to pause the video, and then I'd like you to complete this table and then complete the quadrant in terms of what each sign of the quadrant should be. So go ahead, pause the video, and I'd like you to do that for yourself, and then in just a couple of seconds, you'll see me come back on, and I'll have the full answers for you. Okay, so there the chart is already completed for you. But before I move from here, I want to once again reiterate that root 2 over 2 can sometimes be written as 1 over root 2. Remember, that's just 1 over root 2 rationalized is what makes root 2 over 2. And the root 2 over 2 version fits nicely with our 1, 2, 3 theme that we have in our table. Okay, so let's do some examples of how to do some questions here. So let's say I asked you, how would you do the cosine of 3 pi over 4? Now, the first thing that you should notice is that it is a pi over 4 angle, which means that I'm going to look in the column that has to do with pi over 4. Cosine of pi over 4 is root 2 over 2. So that's the easy part of things. Now, what the 3 basically tells me is to tell me which quadrant this angle falls in. Remember yesterday, or in the video the last time, we looked at how do you find each quadrant angle. We know that pi over 4 is the first quadrant, but how do we figure out the second quadrant, the third quadrant, and the fourth quadrant? If an angle can simplify, then that's not it. So in other words, 2 over 4 can simplify. Therefore, that's not the second quadrant angle. What we want is 3 pi over 4. And then again, 4 pi over 4, that simplifies. So 5 pi over 4 would be the third quadrant angle. 6 pi over 4 simplifies. 7 pi over 4 would be the fourth quadrant angle. So looking at that, that tells me that 3 pi over 4 is the second quadrant angle. We know in the second quadrant that sine is positive, so that means cosine must be negative. And so my answer to this would have been negative root 2 over 2. Let's try one more, at least a couple more. Let's try cosine of 11 pi over 4. Again, it's a pi over 4 angle, so therefore the root 2 over 2 stands. The part about the 11 pi over 4 is that it's got to tell me which quadrant we're in. Now you might notice your 1, 2, 3, 4th quadrant are still right here on the screen. And we already know that 7 pi over 4 is in fact the 4th quadrant angle. But 11 pi over 4, of course, is more than that. Remember that our trig functions are cyclical, and so we can actually figure out, okay, that would mean the next pi over 4 angle would be in the first quadrant and so forth. So let me do that. 8 over 4 is 2 pi. That simplifies. That's not what we want. 9 pi over 4 does not simplify, and so that brings us back to the first quadrant angle. 10 over 4, that does simplify, but 11 does not. So 11 pi over 4 is actually the same question as cosine of 3 pi over 4 because it also is in the second quadrant. And so it too is negative root 2 over 2. Let's do another one. What if instead I asked you for the cosine of negative 5 pi over 4? See, cosine of 5 pi over 4 we can easily see is a third quadrant angle. But what happens when I put a negative in front of the angle? See, instead of us moving from first to second to third to fourth, that's the positive direction. If I want to go in the negative direction, then what basically is happening instead is I'm going to go to the fourth quadrant, and I come back around this way. That would be your negative direction. So if I'm doing negative angles, let's think of it this way. We, again, know that pi over 4 is the first quadrant angle. We know that 3 pi over 4 is the second quadrant angle, and so on down that direction. But if I want to go in the opposite direction, in other words, negative pi over 4, that would be the fourth quadrant angle in here. And then negative 3 pi over 4 would be the third quadrant angle. And negative 5 pi over 4 would be in the second quadrant. So it is the same question as these other two. It also would be negative root 2 over 2 being found in the second quadrant. Interesting as that may seem. All right. Now hopefully that gives you enough examples of how to do these. I'm going to erase this just so it neatens up a little bit and put my all student state calculus part again, because being able to answer those questions helps tremendously. So let's just do one more that's not a pi over 4. Let's try sine of 11 pi over 6. Go ahead and give that one a try on your own. At this point, what I'm looking for is that you notice that it is a pi over 6 angle, and so that would mean it is a 1/2 result. However, we just need to know which quadrant we're in. So let's get back to our pi over 6 is our first quadrant angle. Then we'd have our second. We have to see what simplifies. 2 over 6 simplifies, 3 over 6 simplifies, and 4 over 6 simplifies. So 5 pi over 6 is our second quadrant angle. 6 over 6 simplifies, 7 over 6 does not, and so 7 pi over 6 is our third quadrant angle. 8 over 6, 9 over 6, 10 over 6, they all simplify, but 11 over 6 brings us to our fourth quadrant angle. So basically what we're looking at is sine in the fourth quadrant. We see that cosine is positive, that must mean then that sine is negative. And so that's how we would answer that question. And hopefully that's enough examples for you to be able to determine how you use the angle to determine which quadrant we're in, and simply what part of the reference chart we're going to look at. Now to change gears a little bit, we're going to look again at something, well, it really doesn't change gears much, to be quite honest. It's just a different aspect of looking at a different perspective, so to speak. It says if we know that sine theta, or sine of an angle, is 1 over root 2, basically what is cosine and what is tangent? So I'm going to flip back and forth here a little bit. It says we know that sine is 1 over root 2. So what that means is I'm going to look in my chart here, and I'm going to say, okay, where do I see sine is equal to 1 over root 2? Keep in mind that 1 over root 2 is the same thing as root 2 over 2. All right, you may not realize I just had to stop the video there. I was interrupted, so I'm sorry about that. So hopefully I pick up right where I left off. What I'm guessing is I was saying you want to look at the chart for where you see that 1 over root 2, where sine is 1 over root 2. And if you look at the chart here, you'll notice that that occurs, of course, at pi over 4. So knowing that, basically what this is saying then is we know that theta then must be pi over 4. So the question is really saying what's the cosine of pi over 4 and what is the tangent of pi over 4? Now that's the easy approach to this, but I have to caution you a little bit because sine is not only positive in the first quadrant, but also in the second quadrant. So this could not only be talking about pi over 4, but 3 pi over 4. And so we're actually going to answer both of those. Because we don't know which quadrant we're talking about, we have to address both of them. And you'll see how that answer will come out. If I was to ask you the cosine of pi over 4, hopefully that's easy enough without me looking at the chart. You can see that that's root 2 over 2. And the tangent of pi over 4, if you need to look at the chart, go ahead and look at your own, is 1. So the cosine of 3 pi over 4 just means it's the cosine in the second quadrant. Which if you remember, cosine in the second quadrant is negative. So that would be negative root 2 over 2. And tangent of 3 pi over 4, instead of being positive 1, in the second quadrant, it also is negative. Therefore, the easy answer to this would have been the cosine of this angle then would be plus or minus root 2 over 2. And the tangent of this angle would be plus or minus 1. Unless they specify which quadrant, which in some cases they will. Some cases will say, okay, you're in this quadrant, or they'll have a fancy way of saying it, like between this domain, 0 and pi over 2, or whatever. They'll give some kind of restriction to tell you which quadrant they're in, and only then would it just be limited to one answer on those. But since it doesn't tell me which quadrant we're operating in, it could be either the first or the second, because that's where sine is positive. And so that lends itself to both positive and negative cosine and positive and negative tangent. Okay, so those are the notes for today. And hopefully that gives you some clarification. Tomorrow we'll be practicing quite a bit of this. So, all right, thank you.